All right, you're live.
Thank you, Lauren. Good evening. My name is Dr. Eric Isselhardt, and I am the President and Acting CEO of the National Network of State Teachers of the Year. And this evening's Facebook, Welcome to It, One and All, is a conversation with nationally recognized educators and researchers about a report that was 2 years in the making, a report and a toolkit that we produced called Rebuilding the Ladder of Educational Opportunity. And it was funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation through generous funding through the foundation's work. And throughout this evening, then, we're going to be referring to the opportunity gaps. And this is distinct from achievement gaps. Achievement gaps are sizable and persistent differences in academic outcomes between different groups of students, and they receive the lion's share of ink in the education literature. The groups of students compared include those defined by race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, English learner status, geographic location, and disability status, among others. And achievement gaps are all about outcomes, the results of the education system, with metrics like standardized test scores, grades, course taking, and graduation rates. In this report, though, we're shifting our focus instead to what we're calling the opportunity gaps. And by this we mean, and it's a quote from the Glossary of Education Reform, the term opportunity gap refers to the ways in which race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, English proficiency, community wealth, familial situations, or other factors contribute to or perpetuate lower educational aspirations, achievement, and attainment for certain groups of students. So for us, the term opportunity gap holds a different focus than achievement gap, looking towards the inputs of the system rather than the outputs, which would be more clearly characterized by the achievement gap. And the many guises and at the numerous root causes. As such, then, opportunity gaps have plagued American educators for decades, and the gaps are widening and not shrinking as economic inequality increases in US society. And this study draws together themes and actions taken by schools and teachers who manage to reduce the effects of opportunity gaps in education, supporting their students to success and achievement beyond that of what is expected. We have an impressive group of individuals with us this evening who engage in a discussion guided by several general questions. If you have any questions or comments along the way, I invite you to post those in the comments section and we'll address them as we're able. So now I'm going to turn to the panel. I'm going to ask that each member introduce themselves. And Mary, if you would begin, and then Kathy, and then Catherine, please. Mary?
All right. Hi, my name is Mary Eldredge-Sandbo. I'm a biology teacher at DeLac Burlington High School, right in the middle of North Dakota. And I was the 2010 State Teacher of the Year, and happy to be here.
Thank you, Mary.
I'm Katherine McKnight. I am a researcher at RTI International. I'm located in Portland, Oregon, and I was the person who helped to design the research and carry it out.
My name is Katherine McClellan. I have a consulting business called Clowder Consulting, and I was fortunate to get to work with Katherine McKnight, following up on their data collection and writing the report and getting to interact with the teachers and researchers to create the toolkit resources as well.
Awesome. Unfortunately, not able to be with us this evening is Kalisa Wing, who is also a State Teacher of the Year, but we did pose the questions, the guiding questions to her, and she did respond. So I'm going to read her responses to each of the guiding questions after I ask it, and then I'm going to ask the panelists to respond as well. So the first guiding question is, was there anything in the report or toolkit that surprised you? And Kalisa's response was that one area did not necessarily surprise me, but was a new idea that is not oft investigated, is the idea of respect for families, community members, and students. Sometimes we do not even know how our actions are impacting others around us. Being cognizant of respecting others is vital to closing the opportunity gap. I would push to say that not only do we have an opportunity gap, but moreover, we have a belief gap. If we believe in our students, we'll give more opportunities to all students. So again, I'll just reiterate the question. Was there anything in the report or toolkit that surprised you as panelists?
Well, I can speak up. I guess I would kind of begin the same way Kalisa did, is not so much as a surprise, but for me, it put into words what I had been feeling. So there was this articulation and this better understanding. And two things. One is that even though I teach in a setting that's very different from some of the other teachers, so many of the experiences were similar in looking at those opportunity gaps. And the other thing I really appreciated was the way the academic identity opportunity gap was put into words and described. This is something that has been a concern of mine and something that I've really tried to address in my teaching and in getting to know my students, and seeing it described and addressed in the report and the toolkit the way it was really helped me. I think it'll be easier to articulate that idea with other teachers at my school and elsewhere too. So
you saw some of yourself within the report itself.
yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
That's great.
I was very impressed with how consistently and how strongly, I think, the theme of relationships, personal relationships, and not just with students, but with other faculty members, with the administration at the school, with the parents, with the community, but I heard over and over and over in these interactions with these extraordinarily talented teachers, relationships matter. Relationships are hugely important, and relationships are the basis of being able to really reach students who are suffering from an opportunity gap. So we saw essentially everybody say, relationships are the core and the foundation of how this work can get done and does get done. I thought that was really interesting.
I was going to say something similar at that point in another one, but I'll start with the relationships one. As a result of this work, I had already done some research internationally and asked students and teachers and parents and administrators, as well as researchers and policymakers, what they thought were the most important qualities of an effective teacher. And the number one quality that kept coming up, regardless of which of the 23 countries you were from, regardless of whether you were in an urban or rural area, and regardless of whether you were talking about an early childhood, K-12, middle school, high school teacher, was the ability of the teachers to develop and sustain trusting and caring relationships with the students. And so seeing that again here, what I wondered was if the quality of those relationships mattered even more in the situations where there are opportunity gaps. And there's this wonderful group called the National Equity Project. And I just wanted to read, if you will bear with me, a couple of sentences that they say about this.
Sure.
It's really important. And they talk about the relationships as part of social emotional learning.
Mm-hmm.
And they say the promise of social and emotional development as a lever for increasing educational equity rests on the capacity of educators to understand that, and this is all underlined and bolded, all learning is social and emotional. And all learning is mediated by relationships that sit in a socio-political, racialized context for all children, not just those who are Black and brown. Social emotional learning offers the possibility of acknowledging, addressing, and healing from the ways we have all been impacted by racism and systemic oppression, and to create inclusive, liberatory learning environments in which students of color and students living in poverty experience a sense of belonging, agency to shape the content and process of their learning, and thrive. And I like you, Mary, when I saw this written up in the report in the way that Katherine McClellan just beautifully summarized these data, I saw that as a very important takeaway, in that these relationships are part of how humans learn, for sure, but it's also it underscores the needs of marginalized students, mm-hmm. and helps to create agency in their own learning and engagement in schools where otherwise they may feel marginalized. So I wanted to emphasize that finding. The other one that I was privy to, because I was at all the different, I was either at all the sites or I was at a few of the sites, but I had listened to all of the interviews with the teachers and read all the data, like Katherine. And that was that I don't think any of these teachers actually received any specific training in addressing opportunity gaps. It was something that the schools took on themselves and the teachers took on themselves, but they didn't have a language for it. And when we started defining opportunity gap, the teachers and the administrators who we interviewed said, yes, that's what we're doing. That's what we're looking at, but they didn't have language for it. So that was another surprise.
That also speaks to the dearth of research that is centered around the opportunity gap. I mean, there certainly is some, I'm not suggesting otherwise, but compared to the achievement gap research, which is far reaching and extensive, you know, the commonality of language that you're suggesting would really be led by the research. And right now it's just not enough of a bulk of it to really make that difference. And I think it's particularly difficult too, it strikes me, that, you know, when you're talking about relationships are key, and that was one of the core pieces from the emotionality of the research and the people that we were working with that we saw, you know, ultimately all education, of course, is relational at heart. It's surprising. It always surprises me that that's not where we always begin, right?
Yeah.
Too often we begin trying to solve a problem rather than looking at the relationships that are underneath it, right? And you know, and considering that in every case on either side of either achievement or opportunity or wherever you want to look, the core activity is relational, then the fact that we don't begin there at all moments is, you know, we should be no surprise then that we sometimes don't really, you know, that we miss the mark sometimes. Yeah. So anything else then to be said about that particular question? Surprises? I don't want to move us along too fast, but I am going to be the timekeeper today and keep us kind of rolling. Lovely. So the second guiding question is that as you read the report, what resonated with you? What reflected what you see in the classroom, and what was new information? And I think Mary began to talk a little bit about that. And Mary, maybe if you could expand a little bit on that, but let me share Kalisa's thoughts on that first. So in answer to that, what she says is what resonated most with me was the point about not engaging in a passive way, but being very active with engagement in multiple ways. Opportunity gaps exist because we need to approach them in a holistic way. True outreach means going to the community when they do not come to you, seeing barriers as opportunities for improvement, and getting to the root cause analysis through active engagement. So again, the question is, as you read the report, what resonated with you, what reflected what you see in the classroom, and what was new information?
So I guess thinking, as I read through that, the first part was looking at the data and, you know, kind of identifying what you're looking at. And I love the way that was explained in this report, that it's complicated and there's so much data and it doesn't tell the whole story, but it's still important. And it can help. I think that what helped me reading that is that data that's available to us can help fill in some of those gaps in understanding, but it also can lead to some new questions. And those questions then sometimes to go to the parents, sometimes to go to administrations, a lot of times to the students. And that's the other thing in that section of the report that really struck home with me is the value and the need to just stop and ask students, where are you at? What are you thinking? What's causing problems? What are you wanting to do? All of those questions. And it doesn't always fit in with the curriculum plan, but it can help me do such a much better job of reaching them and teaching them. And it addresses that opportunity gap as well. So, and I've found the more I do that, the more I ask questions, the more I learn. Students love to tell you. They're eager to explain their perspective. And so that is definitely a valuable thing. So that was one of the things, the importance of looking at that data, not getting buried in it though. And I think the other thing, there was a lot that really resonated with me in this. Helping students to believe in them. There was a sentence that talked about there's this disconnect between the teacher's belief in what the students can do and what the students believe that they can do. Oh, yeah. And I think just trying to, how can we bridge that? How can we bridge that and fix that disconnect so that the students understand why I believe that they can do this and how can I understand where they're coming from? And so that just really struck me. And so those are two, I think, important things. And then also the relationships, but not only the relationships with the students, but the relationships with faculty, and how all of the different ways that it was pointed out in the report and the toolkit that teachers can work together. One of the ones I really loved that was a new idea that I hope we can try is pairing up students with former teachers in the district. And that if a student needs a little bit of help, or even just another interested in an adult, and I think the report said something that just gives the idea that you're not my student, they're our students, and just getting that extra care and that expertise from the staff. So those are just a couple of the things that I thought really resonated, and some new ideas that I thought. The one other thing I wrote down that I love the idea, and as a high school teacher, I still think it would be fun to do, is interview the parents. Maybe when they come for parent-teacher conference, what are your kids like? Tell us about what do you want us to know about your child? And asking those questions of the parents. And there were some sample questions and ideas for doing that. So some of the things that I thought, oh, that's so exciting. I was kind of embarrassed that I hadn't thought of them before. And it was really nice because so many of the examples in the report were very doable and things that I can put into practice. So,
oh, that's really interesting, Mary. And it brings to mind something in my own research. So my research is centered all around persistence, why students stay in school or drop out, right?
okay.
And the primary factor universally in any study you care to pull out about why a student decides to stay in or drop out has to do with their parent support, or their parent, whoever's playing that role in their lives, that support to be in school, right? And that should not be a surprise to anybody, actually. But it strikes me, though, if you attach that bit of research and that understanding with what you just described, and thinking about what Kalisa was writing about what belief is all about, right?
Yes.
So how do you engender that belief in the kid, in the student, that they can do it? And if you bring in the teacher and the parents into that perspective, I'm imagining that might be an incredibly powerful model.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Get everybody on the same page.
Yeah, and again, I'm sure it's not new to us, but it just strikes me in the context of the opportunity gap, and trying to address that as a real issue that's across the board without really any attachment to any particular race or ethnic or whatever. I mean, it really is just across the board. You can find it in anywhere you want to look. You can find those gaps. That might be one thing that is a salient element that we should not lose sight of.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and just to piggyback on that too, with my focus on that identity gap, when kids just can't see themselves doing what they would like to do, they just don't believe it's possible. It would be interesting to know what the parent's belief is. And if the parent is skeptical, if that's possible for their kid, then how can we help the parents to kind of, make that leap too and see that it is possible.
That's right. Fascinating. Kathy and Catherine, you want to jump in on some of these thoughts?
I'd say one of the things I thought, and it's related to what you were both talking about, is there was a pretty strong theme from a lot of the teachers about the idea of balancing support and scaffolding and belief and talking to the students and making sure that they hear that they are cared for and that people believe in them and that there are reasons to believe in them, with not lowering expectations. That everybody said, you hold the high expectations, you don't change what you expect from a student, they can do challenging things, they can do difficult things, they can do complex things. And every teacher in the report absolutely believed that of all of their students. So they were perfectly willing to hold the line on the expectations and say, no, I'm not gonna drop what I see you doing, and I'm not gonna drop what I expect you to do, and I'm not gonna drop what I need you to do. You are going to meet the expectations, and you can, and I will help you. And I think those two pieces are the ones that really resonate. It's like, you can do this. I will help you. We will find ways to support you through this, but you can do it. We absolutely believe in you. No doubts about that. And we will find the support you need. We will go out of our way to identify them, to find people to work with you, to find other students to work with you, whatever it is that you need. We're going to find a way to show you that you can do it. Not just say, I'm not just say I believe in you, but show you I believe in you by giving you the support and giving you the things you need to help you through what may be a difficult process. And for a lot of students, maybe a new process where they don't really feel like, up until the point they encounter somebody like this, that somebody really believes in them and will help them through. People will say, I believe in you. But I think the thing that makes a difference in persistence, like we were talking about, is having somebody say, I believe in you and I'm going to stand here with you. I'm going to walk through this with you. I'm going to support you through it. We are going to do it so that you can see that you can do it. And I think that was a really resonant idea, not just for students, but for every interaction you have with people in your life, that's a thing we should all be doing for each other.
That's right. It strikes me that there's an axiom in the kind of ed admin world, and I'm sure there's relevancy to it elsewhere as well, that talks about skills plus motivation plus resources equals success, right? And really what we're talking about the various aspects of those parts in what leads towards success here. And we're breaking those out into some of those relational activities that make a difference. And that's a different way of looking at it. I think I think the outcome from this study with that was really powerful.
I'd like to build on something Katherine was talking about, that I believe in you piece. One of the ways in which I saw it embodied in the classrooms that I was able to visit is teachers allowing students to share their thoughts on things and making those students feel like their opinions mattered, and that they were valued as human beings. So many times I've seen teachers, I know it's inadvertent, I don't think they're even aware that they're doing it, but when a student speaks up, they shut them down. And a lot of times they get shut down because it's maybe what the student is talking about doesn't appear to be related to what they're focused on, or for multiple reasons. And I think shutting people down can create shame and can create a sense that in the person being shut down, that what they have to say isn't being valued. And it's something that I've paid close attention to, and I saw in these State Teachers of the Year that respect that they give these students by listening and allowing kids to share their thoughts and responding to those thoughts in a respectful way is really powerful.
Absolutely.
Eric, I see that we have a question from somebody on Facebook. Are you taking questions right now?
I am. As I go through, I am as we can. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll moderate the questions as we go forward. So the next one, and I will circle back to the question that you all see on the list, but before we get to that, I want to keep building on the themes that I see happening here with the discussion. And the next guiding question is, are there opportunity gap tools / techniques that you use in your classroom, or in the case of the researchers that you know of, that are effective but not perhaps reflected in the toolkit? And Kalisa's review of that, what she responds to is, she says, I love the strategy of academic identity and future self. And I think that builds directly on what the prior question, what the conversation is all about. This idea reinforces the idea of showing students images of themselves in their learning so they can see that they can believe that they too can be successful. This also underscores the need for access and exposure. This is one I would use immediately, as well as changing the questions. In my book, I talk about the need to have high expectations for students. They know when we do not, and we must have the same expectations for all students. So again, the guiding question is, the toolkit offers multiple practices that any teacher may use to mediate the opportunity gap. What 1 or 2 practices can you see using immediately in your classrooms, or in case of the researchers, that you might imagine or have seen that's been effective?
Well, I kind of talked about the 2 that really stuck out to me that I could use tomorrow. And that would be, getting more specific information about their children from parents about their children, just more personal information, and just to help understand beliefs and future, and just get to know more about the student. And the other, working more with keeping those previous teachers kind of in the loop, and maybe even elementary, or in my district, it would be really easy, elementary and middle school teachers. But the other part of the toolkit, there were a lot of things, obviously, but the toolkit also talked about some of those language acquisition skills that are so useful, also are useful in addressing those opportunity gaps. And so I think one of the things that I appreciated in reading this report is just, I think it gives us as teachers and administrators and other stakeholders the opportunity to just reflect on what are we doing that could maybe be tweaked a little bit or done a little bit more intentionally to reach students more effectively and to address that gap. And so that list of different strategies that are useful, they're good teaching practices that, I think it's so easy to beat ourselves up as teachers and think, oh my gosh, I didn't do this, and oh, I should be doing this differently. I think that there's a lot of instances where we are doing things that can be effective, and maybe we just need to be more aware of them and do them a little bit differently or a bit more intentionally. So that was something that I just thought was worth mentioning. So I guess that was my take home from that question.
Awesome. Catherine and Kathy?
One of the interventions that I've delved into in other research I'm doing is the home visits. And I know that it requires assistance and support from the entire school and sometimes from the district to make that happen. But when I've seen home visits done well, they make a massive difference in terms of communicating to families that they matter and that their students matter and that the school cares about them. And there's some great research on the kinds of messages that and the mechanisms that are I'll say the active ingredients of home visits. That one of the big ways in which they can be very, very helpful is in the United States, the demographics of our teaching workforce are very different than the demographics of the students we serve. Mm-hmm. And those differences are growing. And there are therefore some cultural differences and some assumptions that are made on both sides about each other, where home visits are a very good way to help to dispel some of the implicit and explicit biases that create some of the disparities in expectations that we have of students and expectations on the part of the families of the school and of the teachers. So that's a very powerful intervention if it's done well. We did some work with the national, the parent-teacher home visit program, and they have some great guidelines on doing home visits in an effective way. And they happen to have a research report that I helped to author with some recommendations on how to do it. So
nice.
Anyone who's interested, little plug there, but I found them to be very powerful intervention. And they were, some of the schools that we visited were doing home visits as part of their way of addressing opportunity gaps in this study.
Nice. Very cool.
I thought that the bilingual, biliterate program described at East Point, which is absolutely fascinating, and watch that video and learn about that because it's really interesting. But I thought there was an underlying idea there that I suspect we could do a better job of expanding, because there's this idea that everybody involved is a model, that each student is a model for the others, that everybody involved is learning a second language. So the English speaking is not the target in the same sense that everybody is learning a second language. And so all the students act as models for each other, and they're paired up to some extent with, each of them has a strength that the other one wants to gain, and they can support and help each other and build those relationships across students. And I was wondering if there's some way we could look at a more general way of approaching that using that idea that everybody involved is a model, everyone has a strength that they could share with somebody who's not as strong in that thing, and the other person in the pair obviously has strengths they should be sharing, that we tend to pair up students, like if they're being tutored in mathematics or some other content area, we pair up somebody who's strong with somebody who's not, which is not a bad model, but then thinking about the power dynamic in that relationship, so that there's somebody who's good at a thing and somebody who's not good at a thing, that maybe we ought to be looking at trying to sort of make those more equitable, where, yeah, I'm good at math, but you're good at history and I'm not terribly good at history. So you could share strengths and the students could see each other more as peers and less as somebody I must learn from, somebody that they can share each other's strengths and both be seen as bringing something to the table that the other person needs. So I thought that bilingual, biliterate program was a fascinating example of doing exactly that and really making it work.
Oh, yeah.
I just want to agree. I just think that that was so beneficial and so wonderful to really focus on everybody's got a strength and everybody's got things that they can work on. And I wanted to add one other strategy that I think kind of goes on what was recommended in the study too, but giving students a voice and really being brave enough to ask them those questions and then listen to their answers, whatever it is. We've started a student advisory where students recommended students to represent them. And they have really helped us understand some of the things we have thought of as a staff as a just great idea and really going to make big difference. And sometimes they'll agree, but a lot of times they'll have recommendations for how we can do it much better. And so giving giving us the perspectives that they have about things that we're trying to do has been very, very, very helpful. So that asking students, I think is really important.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So the last question we're going to review this evening is a more open-ended question about the future, actually. And the question is, what unanswered questions remain that you believe may guide future work? And I want to remind folks online that who are listening that the purpose of this particular study was really to look at the opportunity gap and not so much the achievement gap. It was very hard to separate those out, though, of course, because the opportunity gap flows right into the achievement gap. But really what we wanted to look at was how do great teachers mediate that opportunity gap, and how can we create a toolkit that any teacher could use to help mediate that through. So clearly, some of the future questions that we are going to be looking at have to do with what happens in that transition out of opportunity gap into achievement gap. And this first study had a huge amount of data around that is not reflected right now in the published report, but which we can use easily to build the next report that will go forward to make that connection now between opportunity and to go towards achievement gap. Nonetheless, so those issues all get tied up in it, and there's still, I think, plenty of issues underneath the opportunity gap question. There's still to be answered and ways that we can go. And I'm going to read Kalisa's answer to that guiding question first, and then I'm going to refer to a question that's in the chat line, and then I'm going to open up to the panelists. So what Kalisa says is, I would love to see educators using this report and creating action plans around areas that where they believe is a need in their school or district. From that, I would love to measure the success of students to see what the impact is from those plans. So again, she's beginning to think about how to connect actual actions in opportunity gap and mediating, and what that impact then is on actual achievement going forward. And in the question box, Simon says, how can teacher leadership impact student achievement? And obviously we didn't look directly at that question, but it was hard not to come across that indirectly through the research that we had, right? So that's not part of this particular study in terms of the published work, but there's tons of data around that. And with that, I'm going to open it up to the panel. Oh, and let me just quickly review the question. So what unanswered questions remain that you believe may guide future work?
One of the questions that all researchers have, and I'm sure educators as well, is, when you're focused on, a lot of people think that, there's a continuing debate in the US and around the world about the purpose of education. And there are many who say it isn't about test scores, but that's how we're measuring the success of our education programs. So when we start talking about doing things to improve relationships and respect of students and getting to know communities, for those who have these urgent initiatives to improve test scores, that's a long way to get there. And I think some of the work is fortunately shifting, and that is about like these ranking of schools and and grading schools. I think you saw the quote in the report about the school that won all these awards and still got a D on their report card.
Yeah.
The D is focused on the student achievement tests, but in every other way of looking at that school was regarded as successful. So I think one of the unanswered questions is, to what extent is focusing on these big areas that a lot of them are going to fall under maybe social emotional learning, and there's this language in research now about educating the whole child, as if that's something new. Wow, really?
Who figured? Who could have figured?
But if we do focus on educating the whole child, then we will value other outcomes as well, and we won't be just prioritizing standardized test scores. So I think some of the big questions are, what outcomes do we really care about, and how can we get at them in the best way so we really are educating our students, and that rather than that they're learning to take standardized tests. So that's a very big answer to the question. That's more of an education policy issue, but I think when you start focusing on opportunity gaps and these questions about who gets what in this education system and what do they come out with, I think we can't leave that stuff out.
Well, and I'd like to follow up on that, because my point was related to yours, Catherine. I know that's a shock. But I think that a lot of education these days, because there is such an emphasis on testing and assessment and data, and that has become to the point where we're sort of drowning in a tidal wave of data with not very much information, that our ability to take all those numbers and all this data and all the test scores and all the other things that we collect and make sense of them in some way that makes them useful, that we have data and data and data and not enough information, that we're collecting so much and not being able to process it or interpret it because it's just an overwhelming tidal wave of stuff coming at people. And I think particularly at teachers, where there's just piles and piles and piles and reports and reports and reports, and they don't have time to process them. And reflecting on Simon's question that came in from the Facebook post, one of the ways I think teacher leadership can impact student achievement is maybe helping schools and systems and districts and administrators to see how to narrow that tidal wave down to something that is useful and is practical and is valuable in terms of changing instruction, in terms of changing achievement, that we're collecting a lot of data. And like, I think Kathy's right, that we're not necessarily collecting exactly the right data in some cases, that we're probably under collecting on some dimensions like social emotional learning or interaction or communication. We may be collecting more than we really need about some of the core content areas, math and English being the classics that everybody measures constantly. That seeking a better balance for data that can be turned into information that can be used in a practical way. And, talking to the parents is, like Mary said, it's a thing we probably don't do enough. Talking to the students may be a thing we don't do enough of. That finding that balance of collecting the things that are valuable and useful, and collecting fewer, if not none, of the things that are just overwhelming detail that can't be translated into action or steps that benefit the students. So I think that was a question I really have, is like, how do we do a better job of balancing that stream to make it more valuable?
Excellent. Excellent.
Great points, both of you. I think I was kind of thinking on line of what Kalisa was talking about, in a way that I just wonder about I think that there is a lot of potential in using the toolkit, and even using some of those questions that were used in the interviews to help us staff work together to understand more. What are the opportunity gaps we're dealing with in our school? And how can we understand that better? And how can we put these descriptions into words? And I think it just has a lot of potential, is really valuable professional development that can be, talked about the importance of professional development in the toolkit too. And how can that be used and then how can we measure the effectiveness of it, I guess. But I just think that there's a lot of value, and it would be interesting maybe following up on that action plan proposal that Kalisa stated. I think that was one of the things that came to me that I think is a question to pursue.
Beautiful. Well, I think one thing that's clear to me from this evening's discussion is that the whole notion of opportunity gap and the way that the study frames the question and the results that came out of it, really we arrive back at some very big questions, but from a not so often viewed perspective, which is the opportunity gap. I think that that's a really interesting way to come at some of these larger education questions. And I think there's lots of fertile ground to be sowed there still around what that really means and what we could develop further. And I just want to tell you how much I appreciate the panel's work this evening. Thank you, Mary and Katherine and Kathy. You've just been really wonderful and insightful, as we all knew you would be and continue to be. For those of you who are listening online, I would invite you to see the entire report toolkit, and the videos are all available on the NNSTOY website. So feel free to drop in there to take a look at those. And with that closing, and thanks to everybody, both online and in America, I appreciate you all. And thank you so much for participating this evening, and have a great rest of your night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Night.